Before heading to golf this morning, the president evidently read the front page of the New York Times, and he wasn't happy. Tweeting, the failing at NY Times in a story by Peter Baker should have mentioned the rapid terminations by me of TPP and the Paris Accord and the fast approvals of the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines. Also look at the recent EPA cancellations and our great new Supreme Court justice. Well, the headline of the article President Trump is referring to, promised the moon, easy for Trump, but now comes the reckoning, referring to President Trump kicking both health care and tax reform to Congress. Radio show host Robert Padillo and Larry O'Connor join us now. Gentlemen, always good to see you. Appreciate it. Being here on a Sunday. Right there it is, front page of the New York Times, upper left, above the fold. Let's take for a minute whether you agree or disagree, Robert, on what the president has done in some of these inches or what he wants to do. It seems like the New York Times is almost gleeful in the thought that he might fail on this. Fair or not?
I think a lot of times in the leftist media, the problem that they come up with is just this idea of pushing the failure narrative. President Trump, in addition to getting approval for Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch, has really reshaped the entire federal court system with federalist judges, in addition to passing almost more legislation in his first 100 days than any president in 50 years. So he's had many legislative accomplishments, but he hasn't had those big box, big name, big ticket issues like the wall, like tax reform, like healthcare reform.
He almost sounds like a Republican radio host
what's
rather
going
than a
on
Democrat.
over here? Yeah, no, but that's pretty cool. You know, little advice for the commander-in-chief, Mr. President: do what the rest of us do. Ignore the New York Times.
He's
Be
golfing.
like
He may not be watching,
right,
but okay.
Maybe he'll catch it.
Maybe he DVR'd it.
But you know, it's interesting. It's everything that the president detailed there in his tweets are things that he could legally and constitutionally do through his office of the executive branch of government. Everything the New York Times is criticizing him for not doing are things that Congress must do. You know, Trump hasn't fixed health care. Last time I checked, that has to be legislation coming from Congress. Now, I know the New York Times, they're used to celebrating a president acting outside of the Constitution and using his phone and his pen, but they're sort of proving the point that we're actually back to how the Constitution and how our federal government is supposed to be functioning here.
Robert, fair to say that the way you read the news and the way they covered President Obama, which I knew you had some issues with him as well and his actions, but it seems to be so vastly different.
Well, I think that the issue is that large portions of the media are funded by the same organizations, same groups, same people, and therefore you hear this echo chamber. If you listen to late night talk shows, it's the same echo chamber of anti-Trump, 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 which does not reflect what many Americans are feeling and seeing. So I think the big problem that Trump has right now is just having the Republican majority in the House, a Republican majority in the Senate, and a conservative Supreme Court. People thought that he would have gotten more of his agenda passed by now. He wouldn't be fighting and calling Bob Corker Little Bob and Marco Rubio Little Marco. He has running beefs right now with about a quarter of Republican senators.
Okay, there's that issue. But on the other side of that, Larry, you talk to a lot of conservatives and a lot of, even if not conservatives, but Trump supporters in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio. You get out of Robert's echo chamber here. They're thrilled with President Trump.
Well, for much of what President Trump does, yeah. I mean, listen, for a lot of voters out there, the president has actually delivered on what he promised in terms of changing the tone, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of actually, you know, fighting for them and sending a message. You know, everyone gets crazy about the tweets, but I'll be honest with you, when I ask callers to my radio program here in Washington on WMAL, or if I'm speaking to a live audience, I say, do you want the president to stop tweeting? They love it. They want him to keep doing it because especially with this morning's tweets, I think it's a very good example of him bypassing the media, being able to talk directly to people. And by the way, most Americans are not on Twitter. You know, if the media actually ignored these tweets, it's almost like, remember the dog in that Disney movie Up? Remember? And the dog had that little mechanism. He could talk to you. He'd be, oh, sure you do. So he'd be the dog would be talking, and then he'd see a squirrel, and he'd go, da-da-da, squirrel. And that's the president's tweet. Every time he tweets, it's like a squirrel, and the media must follow it.
All right. I want to get to this issue, though, what you talked about late-night television, Saturday Night Live as well. WMAL also online, too, if you want to listen in the rest of the country. Check out Saturday Night Live from last night.
What about the anthem?
Oh, it's starting now.
What are the players doing? Are they acting like little SOBs?
I know. They seem to be respectful. Wait. One of them is kneeling.
Get out of there, Mike Bale. Ditch it. Haul ass, Mike. Mike bailed big time.
All right, harking back to last week when the vice president walked out of the Indianapolis Colts game as the players knelt. Never mind spoofing, talking on your phone while the national anthem's playing, but we'll leave that for another day. Robert, you in a way supported the kneeling when this first began. Do you still feel that same way, or is it time to move on from this?
Well, I think it's time to move on to legislation. Remember, the point of the kneeling is to bring attention to the issue, which is the over 1,000 people who are shot every year by police officers. So what the president can do, instead of calling people names on Twitter, instead of making all these divisive statements, is just bring together these sides, put together a presidential blue ribbon commission, and then pass some laws.
But is it really about, and I'm going to let Larry answer this because he had a great piece on this, but is this really about police brutality or about quote-unquote oppression of guys who are making $4 million a year? I've yet to hear any of these players come together in a group and clearly articulate what they're angry about and what can be done about it. This is not Martin Luther King or the Freedom Riders or Rosa Parks or the abolitionists who have a cohesive message and say, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it.
And by the way, Leland, all of those great American movements that you just detailed, going back to the abolitionist movement, they protested under the guise of embracing the first principles that our nation was built on in the Declaration of Independence. They were very pro-American ideals. And forgive me for respectfully disagreeing with you, but the moment this became about Colin Kaepernick sitting down during the national anthem in August of 2016, and he was asked about it, I wrote about this at Mediaite.com, he was asked about it at that time, and he said, I'm sitting because I will not honor the flag for this country. Now, yes, the reason he didn't like the country and thought the country wasn't worth honoring is because of his perceived oppression of African Americans. But as soon as you disrespect the flag, as far as most Americans are concerned, it's about the flag and it's about the country.
Well, and that's what Kaepernick said. We have that up on the screen right now. Robert, I'm going to let you plug your show real quick so folks can hear your response on Monday.
All right. News and Talk 1380 WAOK in Atlanta, Georgia. You can also hear us on TuneInRadio.com. But I think just real quick, what we have to remember is the fundamental point of this.
I only let you plug it because I said, yeah, okay.
The fundamental point is about police brutality. We need new legislation.
All right. Well, that's something that you've been consistent on for a long time. Gentlemen, great having you. Great conversation. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks. Go Redskins.